If you've been watching LPL, you probably think that these videos might be pointless, or if you just started watching this weekend, because the games have frankly been kind of a disaster. First, originally it was supposedly that double limit was taking place, so seed mattered a lot less, and now you're at this place where the 6th versus 3rd seed and the 2nd versus 7th seed don't face EDG in the semifinals. 4th, 5th will face 1st versus 8th in the semifinals. So no one really wants the 4th versus 5th seed, so teams like Invictus Gaming and LGD, who still have a chance to be 6th or be 7th even, or will be sandbagging a little bit more, will be playing a little more dumb stuff. Not necessarily trying to lose, because obviously that's against the rules, but picking things for fun, playing more aggressive dives, doing more troll things. Like IG got 2-0'd by King, who are really trying, and LGD picked really stupid compositions. So you're in this position where it's really hard to gauge team identities based on the games that happened this weekend and the remaining games in the set. So I'm going to try to continue to do these videos based on how these teams were looking leading up to this past weekend. It means I'm not going to be able to use as much footage from patch 5.6. I will try to do that to my best of my ability, but that's the caveat. If you tune into an Invictus Gaming game, after I watch this video and you expect them to play like I'm going to say they're going to play, they might not necessarily do that. Realize that that's the preface that I'm going from. That out of the way, Invictus Gaming is a team that's really old in the context of Chinese League of Legends, so I'm probably going to have a lot more to say about them leading up to LPL, within LPL. I'll try to make that section a little bit briefer, but I think people do like to have the history and the context of some of these organizations and some of these players, because some of these players have been on the team for a really long time. So I will go into that in more detail. Of course, to break out, I always like to introduce the team by how I think their identity is now. What I think the team identity is at this point would be, and to recap, we had LGD was the minion control team. We had Snake as the team fighting in terrain above Dragon team. So I would say Invictus Gaming is interesting because they're the counter strategy team, and what they do is they build their compositions and they prepare for teams specifically based on what their natural style is. So they have these players now who have these very wide champion pools who can play a variety of different styles. They can go for late game, they can go for early game. Their coach at this time, Pumandu, they call him Coach Poo. Like, I know Pop Muffa is also coaching them, but they always refer to Coach Poo. So their pick ban will be very targeted at counter strategy. That's a very interesting thing about Invictus Gaming. You think G Tigers have this reputation too, and Invictus Gaming isn't as developed as the G Tigers in this regard, but this is the direction they're trending in. Regarding Invictus Gaming's history, which I said was going to be long, I'm going to start in 2011 when there was a team called Catastrophic Cruel Memory. Yeah, very kind of emo, middle school sort of name, but this team was one of the top 4 Chinese teams at the time. We had WE, NGG, eHome were the other 3, and they would take some wins off of each other. Catastrophic Cruel Memories roster initially only really had one Golden Era Invictus Gaming member, and what I mean by Golden Era of Invictus Gaming is that the WE versus Invictus Gaming rivalry leading up to 2012 and following after WE fell out of the limelight had the most prominent members being PDD, Illusion, Zzitais, Kid, and Xiao Xiao. So Xiao Xiao was the first one of those to join the team. He played top early on. Other members you might recognize: Whites, Tabe, Chris, who coaches Starhorn Royal Club now, would get bought in August of 2011 by Invictus Gaming, and eventually you see the top teams emerge as WE and Invictus Gaming, and eHome starts to win some games here, tournaments and events here and there, but usually you would get like a TGA qualifier. TGA winner would be a WE, and then IG would win WGC qualifier, back and forth, things like that. So you had a fairly competitive top 2 W in Invictus Gaming initially, before WE was this god team. And then Invictus Gaming's roster slowly starts to pick up the players that they're known for. The next player to join would be, as I mentioned, Illusion joins in the jungle. Illusion was the backbone of the team, even though he did have a lot of these crazy picks. The next player to join would be Zzitais in April of 2012. So they pick up Zzitais. Zzitais' backstory, for people who are interested in Zzitais as a player, is Zzitais is the rich kid from Beijing, from a wealthy family with a family business. He had this to fall back on, to maybe not take League of Legends as seriously at the time, but he was very talented. He could play almost any champion, and I think this is something that he still holds true to today, and that's why he made the transition to top lane very effectively, is that he did have to learn the aspects of the new role, but he can just very easily pick up new champions, is the connotation that he has. There was this conversation between, I believe, you and Sika, where they said that they feel that he has a champion, Ocean, and it's just sometimes the water is murky. He pulls out like these Lux sharks, and sometimes he just plays stupid stuff. That's where Zzitais comes from. That's kind of his background, and going into the season, what the perception may have been of him. Then the next person that they pick up is going to be PDD, the top laner that a lot of people are familiar with. A lot of people said that he was in contention for best top laner in the world at one point. The way he joins is actually very interesting. I said initially he started out as an AD carry. He joins eHome as an AD carry after leaving NGG. He eventually transitions to top/mid solo lane roles. Going into the IEM 6, the Chinese team totally completely bombs out of this tournament. They face Moscow 5 in group stage and get decimated by Moscow 5. PDD says that he has health problems leading into this event. His hand hurts, so a lot of people expected him to retire at that point after the IEM 6 event, and he does, technically. He announces his retirement, he leaves Team eHome, maybe 2 days after, and 2 days is an exaggeration, but very soon after, announces that he's joining Invictus Gaming, and this is pretty entertaining in terms of the fan backlash. That the reaction was, you didn't really have health problems, you just were looking for an excuse to leave the team, an excuse to join Invictus Gaming, and the PDD, one of his aspects was that after that he would constantly make these jokes that he was going to retire, right? Invictus Gaming would have a bad game and he would say on Weibo that, oh, this is really bad, I'm going to retire. He tried to do this joke with Travis, I think at the recent IEM Katowice, where we had Invictus Gaming and WE again, and he said, oh, Invictus Gaming is doing poorly and LPL will probably disband. It ended up going, the interview ended up going to Reddit, and people said, oh no, Invictus Gaming, one of these big classic Chinese teams, is going to disband, that's terrible. But again, it was just PDD being a troll. So when he did eventually retire, I didn't think that he was actually retiring, and then he didn't come back to play, he started streaming, he's made jokes since then that, hey, if IG needs me, I'm here. PDG then joins Invictus Gaming, so we're missing the final member, Kid, who is the last person to join the Golden Age roster of this Invictus Gaming team. The reason why they picked him up is that there is a TGA tournament where he played mid lane for a team called Hangon Club, and they played against WE, and he did really well against Messiah. So they decided to offer Kid a position. Initially, Kid and Zzitais, and again going back to the versatility of Zzitais' champion pool, they would flip off mid and AD carry all the time. IG starts to get a lot of fans, and IG and WE start to emerge as these top two teams. Invictus Gaming's identity at this time was very ham, very dive style, a lot of cheese. Think Unicorns of Love. Think every new game they have like a new cheese strategy. Zzitais has this new weird champion that he's pulling out. Illusion has this new weird champion that he's pulling out. Very aggressive, very fast-paced games. So they could win games off of WE, but WE still felt more like the consistent team. And then this is season 2, right? So you had a lot more international competition, especially between Chinese and Korean and some of these top Taiwanese teams because they were so close by. A lot of online tournaments like Battle Royale, Star Wars League, and Invictus Gaming was in a lot of these finals leading up to this event. They would do well against teams like Azubu Frost. There were a lot of matches that they played where PDD looked really ham, Zzitais did really well. You start to see who some of these carries are going to be in the team. Kid played this he still plays a very similar passive style in laning phase, but ends up doing well in team fights. Xiao was an inconsistent support player. It doesn't get to the point where WE starts to be very dominant in China and also internationally until September of 2012, just before Worlds, where they make this roster change. And FCZF and Clearlove come in. And the funny story about this is I think that WE initially wanted Lucky. Remember Lucky, Royal Club Lucky? So you think about all these criticisms that Clearlove gets. Imagine if they had Lucky instead. But with Clearlove and FCZF, WE starts to become very dominant in China and internationally. After the World Championship, where they had that really long, atrocious set with CLGEU, it went really long, and it was painful to watch, and there were so many tech issues. They went back home to China, and they started winning events. Papa Smithy mentioned he casted Into the Dragon, which had a lot of top Asian teams in it. They then, after that, dominate China, they win IPL 5, and Invictus Gaming starts to look less and less like a viable team. They're just kind of like the joking younger sister. Fans start to criticize them for, if you have time to go out to dinner, you have time to practice, you have time to play. IPL starts. IG still doesn't win their initial games against WE, but then there's that big tournament, that big Star Wars 7 final between Invictus Gaming and WE. And Invictus Gaming starts 1 point down to WE, comes up, each of these players have these fantastic games, like PDD carries really hard in one game, Zzitais does really well in one game, and they managed to flip the series and beat WE 1 game down because they were in the lower bracket. For the first time that any team has beaten WE in 6 months. Invictus Gaming then has their period of vogue where they're winning the LPL regular season spring 2013. Most regular season wins of any team. They are able to convincingly beat most teams that are in the lower half. Of course, because Invictus Gaming has such like an inconsistent style, they do drop a couple games here and there. Actually end up going 2-2 to WE, so they break even with WE. And they end up in the final with the first seed, or in the playoffs final with the first seed against Positive Energy. Oh, and there were clearly like 3 top teams. You had Invictus Gaming, OMG, WE were very clearly the better ones, and then PE was almost in like the next rung with Starhorn Royal Club. But Positive Energy comes around and 2-0s them, and this is when Name has his first like big explosive performance in a LAN. They drop down from there. Invictus Gaming has this period where they're not winning in summer. They're not doing well. They don't even make playoffs. So this is the time when we have to reevaluate the roster. Again, this big lineup that's been successful. Xiao is looking at retiring because you can see these Sona ult montages of him like missing every Sona ult, other things like that. I think he was just not motivated anymore. And he ends up becoming a caster, and they pick up Kitties. And with Kitties, Invictus Gaming starts winning LANs again. They win the IEM Taipei against CGA Entis Frost. They win the first ever Demacia Cup tournament. It was WE Invictus Gaming Finals, which we haven't seen one of those in a very long time. WE with their new roster. Invictus Gaming becomes this newer team with Kitties. Going into LPL 2014, Invictus Gaming was actually pitted as Edward Gaming and Invictus Gaming are going to be the top 2 teams in the regular season, and of course they weren't. Like, Invictus Gaming placed 6th at one point. They ended up going to IEM as the 6th place team, but they started to improve and do a little bit better. They started gaining some ground. They were the only team split even with OMG that season, even though they had like this terrible first run. They started to win some 2-0s. They were notoriously like the GAMT, the 1-1 team, right? Accommodating PDD's new era of shot calling. They ended up making it to the playoffs at the very end because LGD, who was 4th seed until like the last week, lost to the bottom place team playing Twitch Jungle. And then OMG at this time decided, oh, it's a good time to sub in Cool, who hasn't been playing for a very long time, and Invictus Gaming won another game off them. So going into playoffs, we had already seen OMG drop games because Xiong could be exposed if you banned out Syndra, if you camped mid lane, he didn't know how to deal with jungle pressure. Edward Gaming had success doing this at IET, SK Telecom T1K had success doing this at All-Stars. Invictus Gaming seems, at this moment, uniquely qualified to knock OMG out of the playoffs, even though they're 4th seed, because Zzitais' champion pool, as I said, is massive. They play this ham aggressive style. Illusion, at this time, was probably one of the most early game aggressive junglers in China, and they eliminate OMG. They go on and they play in the finals against Edward Gaming because there was only a semi-final and a final. Only top 4 teams made playoffs, and they get completely demolished. So, kind of a fluke. Invictus Gaming places 2nd. We all know how the 2nd season went for them. They don't make playoffs again, but they get, again, because placing somewhat well, they get a seed at the regional qualifier. They lose very convincingly to OMG and LGD. And that is the last we see of that Invictus Gaming lineup in 2014. I didn't really cover why I feel that Invictus Gaming bombed out in 2014, so I'll do that very briefly. PDD retired between spring and summer 2014, and say what you will about PDD, he was a very consistently strong top laner in lane. And by that I mean he wouldn't necessarily completely demolish his opponent, he would just be up in CS or he would break even. Only top laner he really had a lot of trouble with was going, even towards the end of his career. And then they replace him with this player called Youngsu. Doesn't do nearly as well in lane, has maybe a couple champions like Gragas and Shyvana that he can do well on. Their style can no longer rely on top lane to be this pillar that always wins, so they don't really have a clear direction going in. Zzitais had become the shot caller in summer of 2014, and if you've listened to what I said about Zzitais' personality, that sounds like a terrible idea. So they do not do well, but at this time Zzitais plays a lot of Zillion mid, Zzitais plays Lux, Zzitais plays Morgana. Zzitais gets free reign to play pretty much whatever he wants. And he plays Renekton mid. He plays a bunch of other weird different things. Kid is kind of looked at initially in the spring as the new reliable carry of the team. He starts to do a little bit better in lane with Kitties towards the end, still has these really good team fight positioning, can build Trinity Force on Kog'Maw. He's always been a Trinity Force AD carry. Like his Ezreal play is really the only meta independent champion pick for any player that I actually know of. Like regardless of whether or not Ezreal's in meta, he'll pick it and he'll do well with it. His form began to decline as time went on. He didn't do nearly as well. He couldn't carry in the late game as the team progressed, and other teams started ramping up, started doing better with some of their roster changes. So Invictus Gaming was never really a contender in 2014. They decide to overhaul the roster because Illusion might not cut it against some of these competitive junglers. IG starts to look at Korean junglers, very obviously, because everyone is looking at Korean junglers. And IG comes out and says, we haven't really been spending a lot of money on LoL, we don't really have a coach as much. We have an analyst. They lost their coach Tsukasa to OMG, and if you know anything about Invictus Gaming's style of play and what they do, I don't know why OMG would pick up their coach, but they did. They lost their coach to OMG, and they had an analyst for some time who wasn't really being effective. But they decide they're going to invest more money. They pick up Pumandu as a coach, and they pick up Mafa as a coach. They pick up Kakao and Rookie. Initially a different team bought Kakao, and Rookie made some promises to them that didn't pan out, and because their contract had this very loose clause about okay, if I don't fulfill my promises, you're free to go, absolutely free of charge. They also treated Kakao and Rookie very well this time. They ended up on Invictus Gaming. And that's the short of it, is that Wang Sikong, the CEO of Invictus Gaming, is a very, very wealthy individual. He used to be the son of the wealthiest man in China. Some of his real estate assets declined, so he is now only the fourth wealthiest man in China, which, not really that sad for him. A little bit, maybe. Wang Sikong is finally able to come up with an offer and a scenario that works, and they pick up Kakao and Rookie. I think initially he didn't really want Rookie, just Kakao, but they were a package deal. So they end up benching Zzitais, and this is when we get to the point in Zzitais' career where he realizes he doesn't necessarily have a job. They do a rotation thing where they have Save and Zzitais for a couple games, and this was the first 0-2 they faced against VG Gaming. I think probably the other roster would have lost to VG Gaming because the team was relying on Rookie and Kakao as a backbone instead of really integrating the shot calling and the team play and the style. Zzitais now is at this point where he has to start thinking about his values. Does he want to be on the team? And I think the answer turns out to be yes. So he does focus a lot more on leveling up, finding a way to be a niche and to get on to Invictus Gaming, and he claims that he started learning top lane from PDD during this time. Because if you look at Invictus Gaming's roster, they had a very obvious weak point, and members of the team would come out and say Pokemon, this top laner that they had, who he could play a Maokai fairly well, but let's face it, like, Maokai is a fairly simple champion to play, and it restricted their strategy in this way that he had to have this Maokai pick, or the team would essentially fall apart. And Kid would come out and say, okay, I think our MVP for this game was our top laner because for once he didn't make a mistake. Kakao would make jokes about the top laner not performing well. It was just very public. I think eventually they start to say, we need some other option. We can either get a Chinese top laner maybe at the end of the split, or we can look at who is officially on our roster right now, and they end up picking up Zzitais for the first game of the round against WE. Zzitais does not do well. He's diving the backline constantly, playing Hecarim. This is the week they go 0-2 against WE. Everyone is very shocked that WE is able to finally 2-0 a team. Then Zzitais eventually starts playing more and more. We see him in more games. He doesn't necessarily win. He eventually has this win on a NAR game against Energy Pacemaker. They went 1-1 with that set, so that was kind of not that great, but he starts leveling up, he starts winning lane. He starts to do extremely well in lane against some of these really well-established top laners. And this is when I feel like Invictus Gaming realizes that they have a team and they can start developing an identity all around. And this is where I'm going to get into more of the analysis and break away from the storyline. At this point, I wanted to get a little bit deeper into looking at team coaches because I realized that I didn't really talk much about the coaching staff in my previous two videos, but there's an interesting point to be made, and it starts with looking at which teams have Chinese coaches and which have Korean coaches. And by this, I don't mean looking at, obviously, one is better than the other. I mean that when people talk about language barriers and ramp-up time with hybrid rosters, they don't address that sometimes if you're importing a coach who might want to have a language barrier, who might not understand the meta, it might also take a little bit while longer for the team to become more synergized and more competitive within the Chinese region, within some other region. And I think that factor is a little bit undervalued. But the reason why I want to say this is because I feel like LGD and Snake, which are teams that initially started out and initially were rising and looked very prominent and very strong, have Chinese coaches, whereas VG Gaming and Invictus Gaming, who started to rise only recently and find their strategy and find what worked for them, very recently they have Korean coaches. They have Pumandu and they have Home. Also, when I bring this up, when Starhorn Royal Club, they imported their Korean players and they imported their Korean coach, they actually retained their Chinese coach, and they came out and they said that Chris, the Chinese coach for Starhorn Royal Club, was very much in charge of looking at what's good in the Chinese meta, understanding the Chinese meta and the context within that factor, whereas the Korean coach looked more at like an objective, overwhelming pick ban, very like this champion is absolutely good kind of perspective. So I think that that is something that maybe the Korean coaches had to kind of adjust some of their expectations. They're not used to working with maybe some of these extremely young players who want to play like Fizz top every game before Fizz top became nerfed or changed so that it was actually effectively sometimes even good top. So like the AP Fizz top that Carey and Flandra liked to play. I'm not sure that Korean coaches might necessarily be as used to working with that environment. Maybe they are, I have no idea. But I thought that that dynamic on Starhorn Royal Club was interesting and might be able to shed some insight onto why we have the Korean coaching staffs ramping up more than the Chinese coaching staffs who, like, out of the gate knew what they wanted to do to what kind of like how to help their team shape their identity. To address the LGD and Snake coaching staff, because I didn't really talk about them before, they actually both came from the same team. Probably has the title of the worst performing team in LPL history. They only won 3 games of 28 in 2013 spring, the YE Spiders, the Chinese League of Legends team. I know that the Spiders also have a Taiwanese division, but the Chinese division was really pretty awful. But they had a support player, June, and then the jungler was BSYY. BSYY, I said, also played on Noah's Ark with PYL, but these two were on the YE Spiders. BSYY ends up being LGD's coach, and June ends up being Snake's coach. So it was really interesting that, okay, they had this terrible, ineffective team, but their experience ended up being valuable. The Korean coaching staff for Invictus Gaming has Pumandu and Malphite, and they talk mostly about Coach Poo. I don't hear in a lot of interviews much about Malphite, and Poo is usually the one behind them doing the big ban. Obviously, you know Pumandu, the world champion from SK Telecom. LGD, Snake, they're the fallen teams, the teams that kind of have their systems figured out. Of course, now Snake is ramping up again because the meta heavily favors them, but Invictus Gaming, Vici Gaming take a while and slowly become contenders, slowly vie for that top 6 standings, and now Invictus Gaming and Vici have overtaken LGD in the standings. It's a little bit awkward because of the playoff seeding, which we got into on China Talk if you want to watch that episode, which should be out now. Invictus Gaming, as I mentioned at the start of the video, is the counter-strategy team. And the way that they got there is they started out as this team that played just primarily around Kakao and Rookie as this core. And if you watch the first LPL best of 2 between Invictus Gaming and WE, it was very much about just Kakao and Rookie putting the team on their back and going straight through. As time progressed and they played more teams, we saw Kid play a carry role against like Energy Pacemaker. Kid was a really big factor. They started talking about their joint shot calling duo of Kitties and Kakao. So they had a Chinese shot caller and a Korean shot caller to make some of these decisions. Like Kitties would call some of the big objectives like the Baron in the late game, and obviously Kakao would have a lot of the early pressure. So these rosters starts to integrate a little bit, but they're still primarily functioning off of Kakao and Rookie's back. And again, part of that is Kakao has to go top, and then he has to work on Pokemon and make sure Pokemon doesn't just effectively bleed gold. Rookie ends up carrying a lot of the team fighting with just flashy outplays. Very cool-esque style with the Ari and the LeBlanc. It's very rarely, sometimes the Fizz, just generally outplaying people in team fights and killing them and racking up kills. This doesn't work against Vici Gaming. It's very much a team that tries to develop an identity around avoiding fights. They're not going to try to go for the heads up because they know that their laners aren't going to win that, right? So they managed to evade Invictus Gaming effectively, and Invictus Gaming is like, okay, we need to work on our roster. Our roster needs to be integrated. They try to do some more stuff around team fighting with Pokemon. Doesn't really work out. They get Zzitais in the top lane, as I mentioned, and this is when a lot of possibilities open up for them, because Zzitais has always had this massive champion pool. Then you have Rookie and Kakao, massive champion pools. Kid, massive champion pool. Kitties is a bit more debatable. Kind of a little bit more of a weaker point of the roster, I would say, just because he doesn't do well in roams. He's very much a good laning support, but he doesn't do well in roams, and I think that his best support, he's had a very clear best support this season on Janna. I think last year he had a very clear best support on Thresh, so I think depending on the year he might practice a champion more often than he practices other champions. Right now, Kitties has a 5.26 KDA on Janna, and they've picked it in about 14 different games. They have a 10 out of 14 wins, and this includes like the Demacia Cup round of 8 data, including LPL. So it's not every single game, but just overwhelmingly, I feel like his KDA and his win record on that champion really stands out. Now, they have this team, with the exception of Kitties, who I mentioned, is like and even Kitties can play other champions. It's not as good as his Janna, I don't think, but he has the Morgana to fall back on. He's got the Thresh, a bunch of other stuff that they can look at. There is a wide variety of options and strategies available to them, and this is when they start looking at how do these other teams function, and IG's games start to look more and more like these crafted pick bans where they counter the identities of some of the more established teams, like Snake. They counter LGD, they effectively counter, they attempt to go against EDG, it doesn't work out just because EDG is really difficult to, everyone knows that the key to beating EDG, right, is looking at deft, but getting to deft is really hard. I'm just going to look very briefly at some of these pick bans and try to walk through why I think that Invictus Gaming uses the counter strategy effectively. This is one of my favorite Invictus Gaming drafts, and by the way, I'm pulling this from GoToGamers.net. They have pick bans for a lot of different games, and it's easier to look at that than necessarily the VODs, I think, so just pulling these from here. Blue side, Snake, purple side, Invictus Gaming. They know that Snake has two favorite AD carry picks at this point. They have the Kalista and the Kog'Maw. So they ban out the Kalista to try to force it on the Kog'Maw. And they ban out the Janna because that's disengage, and Invictus Gaming wants to run a hard engage comp against the kind of strategy that Snake wants to pull out. They know that if they leave the Lulu open and they ban the Xerath, their Snake is almost assuredly going to go for the Juggernaut type composition, which this isn't really a Juggernaut comp just because they have the beefy frontline tank in the Dr. Mundo. They have Rek'Sai, obviously. So Snake starts out, they pick the Rek'Sai, they pick next rotation Morgana Lulu. Very, very common, or typical, expected. Invictus Gaming expects this. And then they leave, notably, their AD carry to their last pick, just to make sure that this is going as planned. They pick the Maokai, very safe, but they know right away that they banned the Janna. They want to go for hard engage. They pick Victor. That works very well with that. Lots of lockdown. They pick Leona. They pick Jarvan. So all of these things are going for, we want to lock down your AD carry, and we're pretty sure you're going to pick a Kog'Maw. They come out, they pick the Kog'Maw and the Dr. Mundo last, and then for this is the perfect time when it falls into place and they can pick the Vayne. The way they execute this well is they force more mid-game fights where they can use Jarvan and Victor to trap Kog'Maw or Dr. Mundo, and they can use Vayne to just burst through some of the extra health added by Lulu and some of the extra health on Dr. Mundo. This one, they know that LGD likes to push out waves. They go for very strong lanes so that LGD, first of all, is beaten down in laning phase, and that also that they can continue to move around the map and counter some of LGD's pushes. So they pick the Twisted Fate against some of these strong minion wave clears, like Graves against the Rumble, which doesn't necessarily have the best wave clear, but he does have like somewhat effective wave clear, and they see that LGD last picks the Vladimir, and they picked the Vladimir the previous game. I don't think it was that big of an issue for Invictus Gaming to deal with, but they did that. Also, a very AoE, like early mid-game fight composition that LGD comes out with, so they want to pick things that can avoid it a little bit better, like the Kalista has higher mobility, the Nidalee can get away from these fights effectively. You can split push and out-rotate with the Twisted Fate, the last pick. They have very intelligent last picks, is going to be the theme. CCM Zzitais, Sion does well in lane, just like standardly, and they did a lot of ganks for Zzitais this game, just so that he could get ahead and push against the Rumble and just push out the lanes. So effectively they use a Sion split push strategy, and they can use like the global ultimates that he can join fights. and also Rookie's Global Ultimate. So if they need to counter some sort of fight, or they need to show up to get some kind of pick to make sure, because again, with this competition, you don't necessarily want a 5v5 fight. It worked very effectively against LGD's style of play. Again, this draft isn't super great. It just shows that Invictus Gaming has some flaws in their drafting, but they also are thinking about what EDG likes to do. EDG, it's very clear what EDG likes to do. The question isn't how do we figure out what EDG wants to do. The question is how do we stop them from doing what they want to do. They pick the assassin in almost every single game in this set. They go for the Zed. Edward Gaming bans out the Lissandra, they ban out the Ahri, because locking down, getting to the back line, and getting to deft is something that they don't want. Invictus Gaming also picks some more scaling, because EDG likes to do the mid-game composition, map pressure type style, so they're hoping that they can outlast that somehow, and then counter it in the late game. This draft is more recent. Master 3 chooses to use SMLZ this past week instead of their typical AD carry Candy. I don't know if this is going to be a permanent change or not, but the reason why I theorized they wanted to use SMLZ is because SMLZ is an Urgot player. They banned out Invictus Gaming early picks Kalista because Master 3 has relied heavily on having Kalista in a lot of their strategies that have been successful. So they early picked the Kalista so that they can't get that. They're preemptively banning the Rise, and they're banning the Xerath. So if they're not picking the Xerath, they're gonna go for more of an engage type composition, would be a good bet. Like less poke, more engage. So they ban out the Rise just because they know that Rise is better now, and Dade is a big Rise player. They ban the Xerath. They ban the Maokai. So they end up with early picking the Kalista so that Master 3 can't run one of their more comfortable compositions, and then they take all sorts of repositioning tools. So what Invictus Gaming did a lot this past week in fights was they chained repositioning tools off of the Azir, which I thought was really interesting. They did it with a Lulu once, a Lulu support. Here they did it with a Gragas. The interesting thing about the Shen, I don't actually think Shen is that great of a pick, just because I think they could pick it because Zzitais can play it okay, and Zzitais always typically just does well in lane at this point, regardless. It doesn't do extremely well in lane, and it doesn't do extremely well in lane game 2, but I think it's really smart if you're expecting an Urgot pick to Shen, just because, and I don't recommend this more broadly, but it's an interesting idea to pick Shen because you're expecting the repositioning tool, and then having the ability to kind of protect whoever gets swapped in. It's an interesting idea. Okay, so I kind of talked about what I think their strengths are, which are the good drafting, understanding what the enemy team wants to do almost before they go in, and picking to that, and then executing to that. It's not always perfect. Like, those drafts had flaws in them, for sure. On IG's side, I just addressed what I thought was interesting, where they're picking these things to approach the enemy team in a way that counters what they're comfortable playing. So that's the key to Invictus Gaming there. So even if it's not completely perfect, they at least have some idea about what they want to do and what they want to execute. Now, there are definitely flaws in Invictus Gaming. I think that if they don't get certain picks, they have a little bit more trouble executing, like, lane pressure in the early game. And by that I mean Cacao has been a little bit reliant on getting Lee Sin or Nidalee, and I think part of this has been very straightforward, and I want to credit Emily Rand a little bit with this idea. It's very straightforward to use the Lee Sin Q or the Nidalee Spear to signal that you're going in. You're going to follow those up with some kind of execution. Either the Sonic Wave is going to follow up with him going in, you're going to follow up the Nidalee Spear because you pointed out the target, and then you can go in off of that. There's only been one game where he's picked Rek'Sai when Nidalee is available so far. So that's... Cacao will like those picks very much. I am a little bit worried about Invictus Gaming in the new meta, just because they have done very well with those picks as opposed to maybe the Jarvans or some of the other stuff. I think that Sejuani's ultimate can be very straightforward in that way, so that might be effective. they've used Gragas ultimate can single out targets. It might not be as straightforward, but 3.759 KDA on Lee Sin, 9 out of 16 wins, 4 of 8 and 3 on the Nidalee. The caveat there is that a lot of those Nidalee games, like 3 of them at least, are against EDG. So the other weakness that I want to address is kind of hidden within. I think maybe they're just growing pains, communication issues, also focusing on kitties. Sometimes there's a misdirection in fights that just causes a weird scatter. Also, without the Lee Sin pick, not as much focus. So I'm going to show that clip real quick. There are several members of IG going into this fight, and they immediately isolate this target, but more members of the EDG show up, and Kitty scatters the fight in a suboptimal way, and it just looks really panicky. I don't think that that's necessarily typical of the way IG fights. It's just that when they realize they're outnumbered or they're in a disadvantaged situation, they can get kind of sloppy. They like to orchestrate their team fights well. I think that there is a panic miscommunication vector that's a little bit stronger within their team fighting than some of the other top teams. The other thing that I would like to point out is they don't deal as effectively with camp. And this is weird because one of the big examples comes from the King versus Invictus Gaming set. If they're getting camped, they don't really know how to reappropriate the jungle pressure. They don't know how to make up for it in other lanes. But it's worked well against them, against Rookie several times. It's worked okay against Kid a few times. I'm going to show you an example from a GAMT game, where GAMT managed to win a game off of Invictus just by camping the mid lane. And they actually do this a lot when they pick Jarvan. And there's an immobile mid laner, is that they like to camp mid a lot, so Invictus Gaming probably should have or could have foreseen that. Just gonna show you the clip, but there's not a whole lot of detail going in there.
Top lane for IG, looking to once again continue to bully Let Me, but he's pretty tanky. I don't know whether they can. Rookie caught.
Yeah, binding hit, true shot barrage again. The damage is massive from Zhao. Huey runs in to dunk him, and Sync Dream claims the kill.
Yeah.
So my point is, I think that there have been a few instances, like the King instance, the instance there with GAMT, a game against OMG, where they have not reacted well to camp, either with vision control or just with reappropriating the jungle pressure. So I think that these are some of the factors that debilitate IG, is that you can probably out-team fight them if you're careful with your vision, or you can, if you pick away like the Nidalee and the Lee Sin, or give Cacao less of one of his comfort picks, their early game isn't going to be as cohesive, and Invictus Gaming Snowball isn't going to come through. They're going to probably revert back to some of the style that they did earlier, where they just try to extend the laning phase and do well like in the 1v1s, which I don't think works as well for them. I would say those are big weaknesses of Invictus Gaming right now, and where you can kind of see them potentially falling when you get up to higher levels of competition, like Vici or Edward Gaming for sure. OMG sometimes if they're having a good day. After that, just Invictus Gaming is looking really good right now, and I think part of that is just because on an individual level they have very strong laners, they have very deep champion pools, they're able to execute a variety of different counter strategies, they're well researched. Invictus Gaming is shaping up looking really strong. Watching this video, I hope maybe you learned something about Invictus Gaming. If you want to be a fan of this team, they've traditionally, as I've said before, they've had this very fan-centric focus. They do a lot of streaming. You can find Rookie stream on Zenki. You can, I think they have a couple streams on Douyu still, but I think most of them, like Kid and Rookie, stream on Zenki. Interviews with them are going to be typically funny. If you like the KT Arrows, Rookie and Cacao were kind of fun, I think, in that regard. They had big personalities, people, especially Cacao, right? So Invictus Gaming is definitely more of a fans team. I think they're much more serious this year, and that's typified by Zzitais than they have been before, but still kind of an ethic that they follow. Is going to be long. I'm going to start in 2011 when there was a team called Catastrophic Cruel Memory. Yeah, very kind of emo, middle school sort of name, but This team was one of the top 4 Chinese teams at the time. We had WE, NGG, eHome were the other 3, and they would take some wins off of each other. Catastrophic Cruel Memories roster initially only really had one Golden Era Invictus Gaming member, and what I mean by Golden Era of Invictus Gaming is that the WE versus Invictus Gaming rivalry leading up to 2012 and following after WE fell out of the limelight had the most prominent members being PDD, Illusion, Zzitais, Kid, and Xiao Xiao. So Xiao Xiao was the first one of those to join the team. He played top early on. Other members you might recognize: Whites, Tabe, Chris, who coaches Starhorn Royal Club now, would get bought in August of 2011 by Invictus Gaming, and eventually you see the top teams emerge as WE and Invictus Gaming, and eHome starts to win some games here, tournaments and events here and there, but usually you would get like a TGA qualifier. TGA winner would be a WE, and then IG would win WGC qualifier, back and forth, things like that. So you had a fairly competitive top 2 W in Invictus Gaming initially, before WE was this god team. And then Invictus Gaming's roster slowly starts to pick up the players that they're known for. The next player to join would be, as I mentioned, Illusion joins in the jungle. Illusion was the backbone of the team, even though he did have a lot of these crazy picks. The next player to join would be Zzitais in April of 2012. So they pick up Zzitais. Zzitais' backstory, for people who are interested in Zzitais as a player, is Zzitais is the rich kid from Beijing, from a wealthy family with a family business. He had this to fall back on, to maybe not take League of Legends as seriously at the time, but he was very talented. He could play almost any champion, and I think this is something that he still holds true to today, and that's why he made the transition to top lane very effectively, is that he did have to learn the aspects of the new role, but he can just very easily pick up new champions, is the connotation that he has. There was this conversation between, I believe, you and Sika, where they said that they feel that he has a champion, Ocean, and it's just sometimes the water is murky. He pulls out like these Lux sharks, and sometimes he just plays stupid stuff. That's where Zzitais comes from. That's kind of his background, and going into the season, what the perception may have been of him. Then the next person that they pick up is going to be PDD, the top laner that a lot of people are familiar with. A lot of people said that he was in contention for best top laner in the world at one point. The way he joins is actually very interesting. I said initially he started out as an AD carry. He joins eHome as an AD carry after leaving NGG. He eventually transitions to top/mid solo lane roles. Going into the IEM 6, the Chinese team totally completely bombs out of this tournament. They face Moscow 5 in group stage and get decimated by Moscow 5. PDD says that he has health problems leading into this event. His hand hurts, so a lot of people expected him to retire at that point after the IEM 6 event, and he does, technically. He says he announces his retirement, he leaves Team eHome maybe 2 days after, and 2 days is an exaggeration, but very soon after, announces that he's joining Invictus Gaming, and this is pretty entertaining in terms of the fan backlash. That the reaction was, you didn't really have health problems, you just were looking for an excuse to leave the team, an excuse to join Invictus Gaming. And the PDD, one of his aspects was that after that he would constantly make these jokes that he was going to retire, right? Invictus Gaming would have a bad game and he would say on Weibo that, oh, this is really bad, I'm going to retire. He tried to do this joke with Travis, I think at the recent IEM Katowice, where we had Invictus Gaming and WE again, and he said, oh, Invictus Gaming is doing poorly and LPL will probably disband. It ended up going, the interview ended up going to Reddit. People said, oh no, Invictus Gaming, one of these big classic Chinese teams, is going to disband, that's terrible. But again, it was just PDD being a troll. So when he did eventually retire, that's the preface that I'm going from. that out of the way, Invictus Gaming is a team that's really old in the context of Chinese League of Legends, so I'm probably going to have a lot more to say about them leading up to LPL, within LPL. I'll try to make that section a little bit briefer, but I think people do like to have the history and the context of some of these organizations and some of these players, because some of these players have been on the team for a really long time. So I will go into that in more detail. Of course, to break out, I always like to introduce the team by how I think their identity is now. What I think the team identity is at this point would be, and to recap, we had LGD was the minion control team. We had Snake as the team fighting in terrain above Dragon team. So I would say Invictus Gaming is interesting because they're the counter strategy team, and what they do is they build their compositions and they prepare for teams specifically based on what their natural style is. So they have these players now who have these very wide champion pools who can play a variety of different styles. They can go for late game, they can go for early game. Their coach at this time, Pumandu, they call him Coach Poo. Like, I know Pop Muffa is also coaching them, but they always refer to Coach Poo. So their pick ban will be very targeted at counter strategy. That's a very interesting thing about Invictus Gaming. You think G Tigers have this reputation too, and Invictus Gaming isn't as developed as the G Tigers in this regard, but this is the direction they're trending in. Regarding Invictus Gaming's history, which I said was, if you've been watching LPL, you probably think that these videos might be pointless, or if you just started watching this weekend, because the games have frankly been kind of a disaster. First, originally it was supposedly that double elim was taking place, so seed mattered a lot less, and now you're at this place where the 6th versus 3rd seed and the 2nd versus 7th seed don't face EDG in the semifinals. 4th, 5th will face 1st versus 8th in the semifinals, so no one really wants the 4th versus 5th seed, so teams like Invictus Gaming and LGD, who still have a chance to be 6th or be 7th even, or will be sandbagging a little bit more, will be playing a little more dumb stuff. Not necessarily trying to lose, because obviously that's against the rules, but picking things for fun, playing more aggressive dives, doing more troll things. Like IG got 2'd by King, who are really trying, and LGD picked really stupid compositions. So you're in this position where it's really hard to gauge team identities based on the games that happened this weekend and the remaining games in the set. So I'm going to try to continue to do these videos based on how these teams were looking leading up to this past weekend. It means I'm not going to be able to use as much footage from patch 5.6. I will try to do that to my best of my ability, but that's the caveat. If you tune into an Invictus Gaming game, after I watch this video and you expect them to play like I'm going to say they're going to play, they might not necessarily do that. Realize that that's